Okay, welcome. So today's meeting is covered by the Linux Foundation antitrust policy. That antitrust policy can be found at linuxfoundation.org/antitrust-policy. And I will send you in the chat the link to our meeting notes, which also includes all those links to the policies and governance in charge of this. That really means that we're not talking about financial gain or other business opportunities at this meeting. This is a technically focused discussion. The other governance for this discussion is the Cardea Code of Conduct, which is also in our meeting notes and you can find on the website. The link is a GitHub and you can find the details there. But the summary is that everybody at this meeting is encouraged to have a voice and to participate, and you need to be nice to those who are engaged in this community. If there's any issues, you can reach out to Ken or I or the Linux Foundation to address that. Okay, is there anybody who would like to introduce themselves today? Maybe you're new or it's been a while.
I can go first. Simon invited me to attend. Just curious what's going on and what he's been up to. I work as a software engineer for Adobe and I do a lot of backend development, but I'm curious on what you will be talking about.
Welcome. Anyone else?
Keela, this is Bill Hinn. For a lot of you, I'm also AKA Lease Scanner. So you can see that on my little name there. It's just nothing, but I'm with Lorca Identity, based here in Houston, and really excited about being here. Also, I think you need to add water to your flowers behind you.
I know. Yeah, it's the end of the season in New York, so they're looking a little sad. It's better than no flowers, even ones that are wilting. Excellent. Thanks, Bill.
You bet.
Anyone else? Okay, well, why don't we start with an update from Trevor? There was a steering committee meeting that happened earlier this week. And Trevor, if you could give the group an update on that discussion.
Hello, everyone. So the steering committee met yesterday, and the major topics of discussion involved them being updated about progress of Cardea to date, and also to talk about the agenda for the next quarter. And two items emerged as again as sort of critical to focus on next. One of those will not surprise you at all. It's machine readable governance. And the second item is development or incorporating smart cards into the whole process flow. And I'm not going to try and summarize that technical discussion, either Keela or Ken can, but it was decided that in competing with, in expanding to deal with on-the-ground realities, we should prioritize smart cards because they're being wheeled out and used and creating problems in the US. And then we should, once we've solved that problem, move to think about how to integrate with Europe's digital COVID credential. So that was one of the major topics. We also briefed the steering committee about last week's discussion at the working group around URL shortening and connected versus connectionless. There was unanimous agreement that the language that we proposed, if you want me to share this, if you want to let me share the screen, I'll share that paragraph.
Go for it.
Okay. Which is basically this. that will be added to the Cardea governance framework. So by the time today is over, the governance framework will be available on the Cardea website. So we also discussed some other branding issues and sort of synergizing with LFPH a bit more, but and we will brief you in due time on what, as we ruminate a little bit more about how to best present some of the branding issues and challenges. We will brief the working group as to a suggested course of action that everybody can take. Is that, Ken and Keela, is that sufficient or is more detail necessary?
I guess it depends. Are there any questions?
Would there be any wisdom in tying the language used to specific RFCs and protocols in Aries, or the most recent is sufficient?
Good question, and I'm going to throw that at Ken.
And I'll send it right back to James. Do you have anything, a specific question around an RFC, or in general, do you think that are you asking that question?
Partially in general, like my thought process being here is that you may be able to say this is the standard for Cardea, for instance, would be using out-of-band invitations and the associated protocols. And if the community comes out with a newer protocol, you may want to evaluate that protocol first and or have some kind of transition within this community. So tying Cardea to a specific protocol or version could provide benefit there.
I do think that we need to get that level of specificity, but I don't think it needs to go in our overall governance. I think that belongs in our interop profiles. And so if we do not have such a file created, that's the appropriate place for that to land. It does need to land somewhere, probably not in the overall governance of the working group, but in interop.
Agreed.
Agreed.
Any other questions about what happened at the steering committee or the discussions that were going on there?
Was there maybe a reminder would be helpful on connection lists? Was that something that was discussed and or decided on, or was there more discussion needed on the technical aspects?
We did bring it up at the steering committee and communicated that the working group, that this group communicated that there was a desire to not support connection lists as an interfacing protocol. And so we communicated that to the steering committee. There were no objections to not proceeding with connection lists. In other words, we are good to go. We will not be spending time on supporting that method.
Thank you for the update on that.
We did have a follow-up from the last meeting to circle back with a couple of people who were using connection lists. We had heard from one participant in these groups who had previously supported connection lists that indicated they were shifting away from that. But I'm not sure if there were other offline discussions around those participants who had used connection lists for the interopathon. Or if we have anyone on the call today who has an opinion about connection lists. Otherwise, we are good to go from a steering committee perspective. Okay. With that, thank you, Trevor. And we're going to move on to, we have sort of two agenda items today. One is to talk about the enterprise agent documentation, and the other is to talk about machine readable governance, which, as we've stated, is sort of the focus for the next phase of development. It'll take, I'm sure, a couple of layers and phases within machine readable governance. But in terms of the documentation, Mike, I believe I'm handing the baton to you.
I was so busy preparing for my machine readable governance, I had forgotten that we were talking about documentation today.
Would you like to
Whoops.
start with machine readable governance?
So the summary on the documentation is that we had a team effort at Indicio to go through and document the major components of the system. We sent it off to our technical writer / editor for review. She's provided the feedback, and all that's left is for me to get it posted out to the Cardea repositories. So that's coming very, very soon, and will be just available alongside all the other files that run the systems. Any questions on the documentation?
So maybe we can do a walkthrough of that next time, or as soon as the documentation is publicly available. And is there an anticipated time frame for that? Within a day, a week, a month, a year?
Well, honestly, it's supposed to be out there right now, and I have a client that I'm working with that needs that documentation over this weekend. So I will have at least one repository with the documents in it by Monday. So
Okay.
we can walk through it. I can show people what files are there and what's described, etc. We can do that next Thursday.
Okay.
And Mike, does that include, is that just the enterprise agent, or are there other components in that documentation as well?
It'll be the front end and the back end for the enterprise issuer, health issuer, and travel issuer or government, and then the enterprise verifier. So those 3 agents. I think that the mobile team has worked on documentation separately, and we're probably doing better than we were, but I don't know the status on theirs. So
Give them to me one more time. It's the health issuer.
So health issuer, travel issuer or government, and the enterprise verifier.
Great.
I guess we call them lab and government and verifier. So many names.
Yes, that's why I wanted to make sure we documented it correctly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so documentation, quick, check. Any questions on that? Otherwise, we'll circle back on it next week. And we can move on to machine readable governance.
So this will be, some of it will be unfortunately a review for people who have been here for a couple of these presentations before, but we get new people every time. And so, and there have been some small updates. So the review will be useful, even though a lot of it will be familiar. So the good news today is, besides just theory, we have some code that is actually reading the governance files and putting it into practice in the government agent. And it's going to still take just a few more weeks to have some pull requests and have that into the enterprise agents. But it's fun to have something to demo. So one of the questions we get about machine readable governance, let's see, okay, I'm on the right slide, is that aren't the protocols good enough? We have lots and lots of protocols in Aries and Indy and so on. That's, they allow you to agree on how something should work. But there's some things that are missing from protocols, like there's usually extra context around a particular ecosystem. There's you need to somehow establish trust in the various agents that are participating. And the protocols are atomic. They don't string together a series of actions that would lead someone from point A to point B to C to D to a desired outcome. So you need a way to describe how things flow from one step to another. So we've relied heavily on some initial work by Daniel Hardman, and he described a governance framework thusly. He said, governance framework, also called a trust framework in some contexts, is a set of rules that establish trust about processes and indirectly about outcomes, in a given context. So this could apply to offline or written or human governance, and not just machine readable governance, but this is kind of our starting point. And machine readable governance, it would be governance frameworks embodied in formal data structures. So it's possible to react to them with software, not just with human intelligence. And so there's a lot of power in allowing our tools to understand how things are supposed to work, so that you don't have to rely on users to understand what to do, especially when you get down to end or consumer type users who are not trained in the systems and just want to get on with their lives. So machine readable governance can provide information about the roots of trust, helps you organize your ecosystem by codifying your rules, conventions, and standards. It can help you decouple a fair amount of your business logic from your code, so that you don't have to hard code everything. And this helps with things like if you make changes or updates. So one particular thing we're pretty interested in lately is the changing guidance on COVID health standards. If you make an update to the health standards, you don't necessarily have to update and then re-release all of your agents. You can just update the governance file and then have those agents read the governance file and use those new ideas. So in previous presentations, we talked about grouping the things that would be incorporated in a governance file, and they kind of fall into assets, the nouns of your system, actions, the verbs, and then authorizations, which of those assets are allowed to do which of those actions. So we'll be going into some fine detail on what is included in a governance file, at least the way we've done it so far. And there's some other types of files that we'll be covering later. So this will be good. Okay, so the root of a machine readable governance framework is the governance file. We typically call ours governance.js or JSON, excuse me. It's just a JSON file that encodes all of the pieces of the governance, and we're linking out to other assets in other places. And so this central file is kind of the glue that holds the whole thing together and is the source of truth, and gets updated from time to time to reflect how things are progressing. So next couple sections, we'll just go through the large blocks of code that make up a governance file. And the first one is there's some useful metadata that you can include, provides some context about the governance, who is issuing this governance, and where to go to find out more information, and things like that. I've got a notification that, oh great, popped up and blocked my forward and back arrows. Sorry about that. Okay, let's see. So here's a code sample for a governance file starting at the beginning. So we've been including a reference to Daniel Hardman's original RFC on machine readable governance. And until we get to writing a more up-to-date one that accurately describes the governance we're using, that'll be the reference there. A name for this governance system is useful for people so they can understand in what kind of ecosystem or sphere of influence they're playing. So, this was pulled from our Aruba trial and the code that was contributed to establish Cardea. It's good to have a version number so that you can provide updates without breaking agents that were relying on things in a particular configuration. You could have several versions living in parallel as long as all the systems could understand them. And then format number would be good if if we were to dramatically change what's in a governance file, we could change the format number so that people would understand that, oh, we switched, this big section is now changed or missing. And so if you were depending on that being there, it's no longer there. A unique identifier would help people to know some of these things as different from other ones without. So like, for example, if you had two people who accidentally named their governance file the same thing, if they had unique IDs, you could distinguish them even though the names were the same. Description is useful in case you're selecting from a variety of governance files. So if you travel from New York to Aruba, or from New York to Europe, or Los Angeles to Canada, or something like that, you're likely to be switching the jurisdiction where governance is applicable. And so you could have your agent detect that you're in a different place, or you could load a new governance file, and this description would help you know what you're getting into, what system you're using. Last updated could be helpful in case the version or the ID number is, this is a human-friendly field versus a unique ID that's kind of random stuff. And then we're going to include some URLs that describe some documentation and data that go with this governance file. Just a few more, and then we can take some questions. So topics are kind of like tags that say what does this governance file relate to. These might be really interesting if you say had a directory or a trust registry, some system that would aggregate or list governance files for agents to pull from. So you could say, I'm looking for governance files related to medical or travel stuff, and then you could go find them and look through them. Or if you had one that was, you have a completely different sphere of influence, you could have banking or shopping or contracts or different other kinds of topics, and that could help people identify them. These are some examples. It's not exactly how you would format this, but for jurisdictions, you would say, where does this governance apply? So for Aruba, it might be AW. For Ontario, it could be ON. You could say in US, in the state of New York, in New York City. So these are some examples of how to tell people what the jurisdiction is. And the geos would be another way to, so this is where the legal stuff has sway, and this is kind of the region or the area that might be local or close to a jurisdiction. There's a lot of metadata that you could include. And so, some of these, for example, jurisdictions and geos might be too redundant. We might be missing something really important, but this is what we're starting with. And we'll kind of, we'll populate these fields and see how it works. And see what kind of feedback we get and if there are any shortcomings. All right, so are there any questions on metadata so far?
I have a question.
Uh-huh.
Is version and format potentially redundant? Or is there a line where you would use one and not the other?
That's a good question. So let's say that we're going to use the same format a couple different times, but the version number might update to say, let's say, for example, later on in the governance file, we have a list of participants. So we say we've got the Bronx, Rio, and we have a hospital in Aruba, and we're trusting an issuer from Liquid Avatar in Canada, and we release that list of participants. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, we sign up, 4 more participants. So now we've got England and San Francisco and Brazil. And those would be included in a new version of this governance file. You'd say this is going to be updated content, but it's using the exact same format. It's in the same labels and structure.
Do you
Great.
ever anticipate having the same version of the file in 2 different formats?
I suspect that if you were transitioning between formats, that you could possibly have to encode to have two different versions or two different formats with the same version number to say, yeah, we've got, we had to update the issuers, and we have to provide the file in two different formats because we're changing from one to the other. That's a good question that might be a potential complexity or problem that maybe we haven't considered yet.
Yeah, and I think clarifying the use of each of those is probably valuable to avoid some discrepancies in how people implement them. But yeah, I think your explanation certainly helped. Structurally, if they're different, they should be format. Content within that structure should be version. Is that about right?
Yeah.
Look at this,
All right.
instant gratification.
There you go. Okay, so we'll move on to the next piece here. So the next section of the governance file is a list of schemas. And as hopefully we all know, the schemas are and their attributes are the foundation of trusted data. That's how we specify how we're going to pass stuff around and verify things. And one of the most important things for governance and interoperability is that everybody agree on which schemas you're going to use. So for this case, we're doing some KYC. So we'll be validating someone's email or their SMS number. There'll be a medical release involved to say, yes, I sign off on I'm taking my own data for this purpose. And then we have our standard schemas that we've worked together very hard on and agreed on. We have lab orders, lab results, vaccines, vaccine exemptions, and then the trusted traveler. And so that's the list of schemas that are being applied to this particular governance file. And code exists in different agents. So for example, in Akapai, where you can take this ID and then look up the schema and get a list of attributes. So now that we have a list of schemas that we're using in a governance file that we can read, one of the things that we'll be putting on the roadmap is the ability for the Cardea agent to be able to dynamically read and then provide a UI for different schemas. And so if we were to say, need to update, let's say we have to update the vaccine schema or add an additional schema, hopefully the agent would be able to respond automatically instead of having to change hard-coded values. All right, questions on schemas? Excellent. Okay, so now we're getting into some newer territory. I think that we've highlighted before, but this is where we start looking at things that we've done in code that are new. So the list of participants allows people to figure out who to trust. And you could, in the linked materials, like the docs or the data or whatever, you could describe corrective action or recourse if one of the trusted participants misbehaves. So here's a sample list of participants. If we have the Aruba government and the hospital in Aruba as one of the issuers, and the Hilton Casino. And so these are just, this is kind of a metadata about the participants. As Sam Curran has said, there eventually will be ways to discover this information from other places and so on, but since there's not an agreed upon mechanism for that, the governance file is a good place for this to live. So this ID here would be a DID. We just have some examples in here so that they're easier to read and distinguish, later on in the code who is who, but those would be actual DIDs. And then you could have a short label, a sub label, a website if necessary for that particular entity, and then a contact email. Those are some ideas of things you could attach to a participant so that as you read the governance file and see who is acting in this sphere and who is trusted, you'd have the information you need about them. Some other ones that you could put in here would be like, there's an airport lab instead of the hospital. There are other verifiers. You could say, besides hotels, you could do restaurants or the beach or an airport or an airline, things like that.
Mike, can you define participant? Participant, like how does that translate to the data that you would get in a credential? Do you define which fields can be populated by the quote unquote participant in the governance, or are you going to get there?
We're going to get there to what participants mean, but the basic idea is the participants are named and trusted agents. So they're issuers or verifiers who are participating in this ecosystem, in which you have an interest in kind of pre-clearing for doing things. So if you load up your mobile agent and you say, I want to use the governance for Aruba, then if you load the governance from Aruba in your mobile agent, then you would know which issuers you could work with that would be trusted. So you'd say Aruba has talked to these issuers and enforced security standards and signed contracts and whatever to make it so that they're part of this, the offline governance and the integrations, technically speaking, and so on, are all handled, and we know that they're going to do what we want them to do without stealing our data or accidentally leaking it or otherwise being bad actors. In some cases,
Mike,
you could even have
as loose or as tight as the governance file creator wants it to be, right? They could say, there is no formal agreement, we just trust these issuers. Or it could be as stringent as they've signed a contract to agree to abide by certain principles or something like that. But that's not specified in the governance file. That's up to whoever created it, right?
Right, and that's why the docs URL is so important to go up and say, I'm going to read this to see if I'm concerned or I need more detail. I'm going to go look and see by what conditions these people are bound. All right. Next, we have roles, and this kind of categorizes participants in the system. So for example, this governance file has two different types of verifiers. We have travel verifiers, at least two different types. There's the health verifiers, people who can verify your health data. There are travel verifiers, people who can verify your travel data. And then we have hospitality verifiers who only need a much smaller subset of your trusted traveler data in order to function properly. So you can kind of put the participants into a role bucket so that you understand how they are supposed to behave. And some participants can have multiple roles if necessary. So for example, the government agent here is both a health verifier and a travel issuer. So we'll look at those here for a second. So this is just a quick list. So if necessary, you could say, I don't know that we'll be using a holder very much, but in some governance systems, it would be a good idea to pre-clear who the holders are going to be. And then we have health issuers, travel issuers, health verifiers, travel verifiers, and hospitality verifiers. This is pretty simple, but unlocks a lot of power, as we'll see in a second here. Okay, so this is where things start to get exciting and not boring review. So there's a section about permissions, and all that permissions do is link a participant to a particular role. So you can say, we're going to grant the health issuer role to this list of DIDs. The first DID would be the hospital, the second DID would be the lab. And each time you add a new DID to the system, you'd have to come in here and add them to whatever roles that they're allowed to have. So we have one travel issuer, and for now we have one health verifier. We have a travel verifier, so an airport is interested in travel stuff. And then we have a hospitality verifier, so like the casino or a restaurant. Okay. So once you map, this is kind of like logging into, let's say you have like a website management system. This kind of helps you to say who are the admins and who are just the day-to-day users or the editors. It's kind of the same concept. Who is acting as whom, and what are they going to be doing? So if you have a health verifier that, excuse me, let's say you have a hospitality verifier. If they ask you for your health information, then you would know through some code I'll show you in a minute, you would know that they're acting outside of what their role is supposed to be. They're being a bad actor by asking for stuff they're not supposed to be entitled to. Okay, so the actions are the verbs. These are the things that can happen in the system, and there's some information about how that action is supposed to happen. So for example, you could have a health issuer that wants to issue a lab order. And so this part of the list of actions would say, when we issue a lab order, we're going to use this protocol, and we're going to start with this message from that protocol. And then we're going to use this schema from our list of schemas. And then we'll talk about presentation definitions later. But basically, we're going to use these standards to verify some data before we issue a lab order. This is pretty technical, but this allows the agents to say when this action is happening, both the issuer and the holder, or the holder and the verifier, would know exactly which protocol they're meant to use and where to start in the state machine for that protocol, which schema, and then some standards for a proof request. And so if you describe all of these, then you can, so we have, in this list here, we have one issue for each type of schema and a verify for each kind of schema. They can get kind of interesting. So like verifying a trusted traveler, we actually have two presentation definitions that define how the presentation is supposed to work. One for the travel verifier and one for the hospitality verifier. The travel verifier is going to need to know more about you than the hospitality verifier. So they have different presentation requirements as defined in the presentation definition. And then here's kind of the keystone to what we've done so far. This kind of brings it all together into some cool horsepower for making governance effective through machines. So this will map the actions that we just described to roles. And since we've mapped participants to roles and actions to roles, now you can do, by kind of a transitive property, you can say which participants are allowed to do which thing. So we're going to grant the issue lab order action when you have any of the roles. In this case, there's one. So if you're a health issuer, you can issue a lab order. If you're a health issuer, you could issue a lab result or a vaccine exemption. We've also put in the possibility for a holder, maybe at some future time or a different system or something, to issue a personal vaccine exemption. I'm objecting, I'm not going to do vaccines for philosophical or moral reasons. So maybe you could have a holder that could issue this one. Travel issuers issue trusted travelers. Verifying identity can be done by, in this case, almost everybody who's in the system, because verifying identity is important in this governance. Only health verifiers can verify lab orders, and so on. And then verifying trusted travelers, you have to be one of these kind of verifiers, travel or hospitality. So this is how you know whether a particular participant is doing what they're supposed to or not. And you can do two things with this. You can verify that someone else in the system is acting the way they are supposed to. And then in the demo code we're going to show here in a second, the enterprise agent is going to look up the privileges that it has that are associated with its DID, so that it, as the issuer, you can behave in accordance with the governance. So you can choose to behave and thereby abide by the governance and be a good actor. So you can check other people, you can check yourself. Okay. I skipped through a
Mike?
bunch of things pretty quickly.
Sorry.
Yeah.
I just have a question. So I just want to clarify that the machine readable governance is applied across the ecosystem. And so you can also prevent, restrict the issuance. So it's not just on the whether you're going to accept the credential when you're reviewing it, but also on the issuance that only certain people can actually issue that credential.
So there's nothing inherent about the protocols or the agents that you could go find some open source code and write your own agent and connect to one of these agents using the standard protocols, and there's nothing to prevent you from doing that. And so someone could say, I'm going to use this schema and I'm going to set up an agent and I'm going to try and issue credentials using that schema, and nobody can do anything to stop that. That's part of the benefit and the power to having a decentralized system, is that you can have lots of people doing things and you can have ad hoc relationships and things like that. The problem is that that could be pretty scary if Joe's tire shop is trying to issue trusted travelers or vaccine credentials.
Right.
And so what the governance does is it doesn't prevent that, but it sure can raise a giant blinking, flashing red light and sirens and say, Mr. Holder, you don't really want to accept this credential because it's not from a trusted source. Or Mr. Verifier, you don't want to accept this credential because it came from Joe's tire shop and not the government of Aruba. So some of the burden goes on the verification or on the acceptance steps. And then as far as issuing, that's self-policed.
Got it.
Privileges help you police yourself.
So the fact that you have, an issuer can issue, this issuer is allowed to, people who are allowed to issue include this list, for example. It has to do, you're not preventing them from issuing, but you're verifying at another point downstream in the process, whether that's on the acceptance into the wallet or on the verifier side to say, did an appropriate issuer issue this thing? Right.
And depending on how you code your holder, it might say, you're not in the list of DIDs here. We're not even going to accept the connection. We're not even going to bother getting to the point where there's a flashing red light that says, don't accept this credential. You might be able to say, we're not even going to bother connecting. But yeah, you basically specify it and check it later. Huh?
It's basically up to the software on each party, but it helps guide and detect whether an action is from somebody who's already trusted or might be out of bounds. And you might be willing to accept a credential from somebody who's out of bounds. They might be a new medical facility that is not on the trusted list yet, and you're happy to take their credential. It's just that maybe some of the verifiers won't accept it yet because it's not been recognized. But there are legitimate use cases out of bounds of the governance, but the governance file is meant to be warning signs or reassurance that a particular participant is signed up to behave in a certain way, and gives you higher levels of trust when you're engaging in an interaction with them.
Yes. Well said.
And I would also say that the ad hoc process makes even more sense to me in the presentations context, so that I have gotten my credential from the trusted source. However, I can present that to anyone I want, even if they're not a trusted verifier, if you will.
Yes, so on all sides, whether it's coming from the issuer or whether you're interacting with a verifier, the interactions can still occur, but they're just not ones that were thought of for this governance. There are also cases, I think, that we need to consider where more than one governance file might be involved in a particular holder's life. Like I might have use the governance file for that Aruba has published to interact with Aruba, but I might, with my employer, have a different governance file that determines whether or not I'm logging into my passwordless login on the company website or accessing company materials correctly.
Yeah, we definitely anticipate layering and switching and sharing of governance files. There's going to be, that's the exact specifics of how that will work in the agents and so on still need to be decided. But you know, just like in your normal life, you have contexts that work in different ways all over the place. You know, you use your driver's license to talk to the policeman if you get pulled over, but you know, it's also used as an ID for proving your age, or that you're a citizen and you can work, or you know, there are lots of contexts for that same, you know, physical credential in our day and age, and it'll be the same thing with some of the credentials that are issued in, you know, a verifiable credential or sense or system. You know, you know, if you have identity or health information, you may use it lots of places. You know, for example, you get it from your doctor and you might need it for travel. You might also be talking to your insurance agent who needs to know some of your medical data, or maybe you're providing some medical data to your trainer at the gym who wants, you know, your blood tests or something. I don't know, but yeah. So we'll encounter that and we'll work through it, and that's why part of why governance files need to be, in some cases, more like guidelines rather than strict shutdown, you know, lockdown rules in all cases. So we'll see how that goes.
Context specific.
Right, context specific. Okay, so now that we've talked through all this, there's more to come. We have discussions about presentation definitions. So defining what goes into a presentation when you do go to verify things. We have workflows with interaction documents, and we have things, additional power to be added to the actions. So potentially like an event bus or whatever, but we'll talk about all of that in our next session. What we're going to do right now is going to go through some code that Simon has written, and you know, a little bit of a demo in the last couple minutes here to show it working in an agent in real life, where he's reading a governance file and then doing something with it. So I'm going to stop sharing, and then Simon, whenever you're ready, you can go ahead and show us a few things.
Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So the current version of Cardea is just pretty much hard-coded everywhere, where as long as the user has a role of admin or a technician, it can issue or verify credentials, and it's not a problem. Except we know that to be able to issue credentials, the agent needs to have a DID anchored on a ledger. So that's the only requirement. But again, it's not stopping the user from clicking buttons and, you know, engaging with the UI. So we're shifting our agents to talk to the governance, and as soon as the agent is installed, we still need to go and anchor the DID. But let's just talk about this from the perspective of the real government. So let's say the government of Aruba, one of the labs, they install the software, then they hook up anchor the DID, and they need to hook it up to the governance. So they go to the governance administrator, who would be a designated person who oversees the governance framework file. And they say, hey, this is our lab, and we would like to participate in the in your infrastructure. in your ecosystem of issuing and verifying. And we have the software, and we also anchored the DID, and we are ready to go. And they hand the DID to this governance administrator. And it would all of the other information that is required for the participants, the governance administrator adds the participant and adds the DID to the ID. And so in addition to just adding the new participant with the valid DID, it also adds the DID to the list of the IDs for the specific action they are entitled to perform. So in this case, we're talking about the government, and it can.
This is a role, right?
Sorry, yeah, that's the role.
Okay.
Yeah, so the roles would be the trusted travel issuer, health verifier, travel verifier. So those three. And so it connects those roles to the DID as well. And so we have the governance file, which is just a collection of useful functions, and one of which would be going into the ledger and verifying or validating the DID. Is this DID is actually a public valid DID? And if it is, we can go ahead and get the permissions by DID. And if there's a log right here, you can see that I'm able to perform this, and here's going to be the DID that is validated, and we can go ahead and fetch the list of permissions that this specific holder agent is entitled to perform. And once we have the list of permissions, we can go and do some checks and see what privileges we can get from those roles that we're giving to the specific agent. And we do some checks on whether we actually have an access to the governance file. We check if we have a valid DID. We check if we have the roles and permissions and privileges. And we eventually get the list of privileges, which is again just an array of them. And this is an interesting part here because on the UI side specifically, we can go ahead and let me just show you. In addition to the RBAC, which is a role-based access control implemented, we can go ahead and add an additional check for the privileges, which is being sent over the WebSocket connection to say, do we have the verify identity privilege? And if we do, we can go ahead and make this call to the Occupy to get the invitation URL. And this button will actually make this call and get the QR code to be scanned by a holder. So if I go ahead and mess up the governance file and get rid of the governance at all, we'll be able to handle some of those checks with the notification error saying, hey, you cannot actually, you don't even have an access to the governance file, or you don't have enough privileges or the right privilege to perform some operation. So there are different ways we can implement that. This one specific is implemented to make a call to the WebSocket connection to to get this to the call to the Occupy. We can also integrate that into the existing access role role-based access control by not just by checking for the roles of the user, but also checking for the privileges to be able to call some of those functions or making the UI be visible or not. So that makes it really easy to control what we allow and what we don't based on the governance privileges only. Again, I just wanted to note that the governance itself is an optional feature that the agent can use or not. At this point, we are enforcing the privileges for this specific agent. In future, I believe we would be able to say, if there is no privileges, but there are actions, we would still be able to handle that. And if there is no privileges and no actions, but at least governance provide a list of participants, we can look at the participants and allow the agent to work just based on that. As of right now, privileges is the main goal to work, and again, this is the way it's implemented on the front end. We're working on some other stuff, which is the presentation exchange, and we are able to permit some actions on, let's say, issuing the credential based on the privilege on the backend itself.
Simon, can I interrupt for a second?
Go
I
ahead.
want you to do one more little demo for me. So you've got the code here that says, if you don't have the permission to issue a trusted traveler, then we're not going to show this button for you to be able to do stuff, or we'll display an error. So if you could go to the governance framework JSON and remove the privilege from this particular agent. All right, I guess show the screen before and after. So go show it with the buttons, and then remove the privilege and reload the screen.
The issuing the credential might be a bad idea right now, because I'm working on a branch which will probably result in error for issuance at this point. But we can look at we can do the same with the the QR.
Okay.
So in this case, this is the verify identity. So would you like me to go and
Right, so
and remove the role?
Yeah. So if you go up a little, I think the big list of them is right there. They are.
Okay, so I can get rid of the list of those roles right here. So this will result in not enough privileges error. And if we bring it back and we have privileges, this will result in a successful connection.
All right.
Awesome. On that note, we're at time. So why don't we end on that awesome little demo that you just did with how quickly and easily you can adjust permissions. Are there any questions before we adjourn today? I think we are going to circle back on machine readable governance again, probably next week, and we'll discuss further. Any questions? Okay, Mike, if you don't mind, if you can send me the link to the slides, we can add them to the meeting notes.
Okay.
Had a couple of requests for that. Okay.
Thanks, Mike and Simon. That was really cool.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah.
Bye, everybody. We'll see you next week for a continuation of machine readable governance.